Without a story, there's nothing to anchor us to who we are. There's no past, there's no present. There certainly isn't a future. My story starts before I was born, here in the suburbs of Long Island. It was a place where, after World War II, men came in order to find safety and escape the horrors that they experienced overseas. Some of the ways that they did this was creating society of homogenization, lawns that were all manicured, neighbors who looked, talked, and worshiped just like them. My parents were able to buy a house in this neighborhood, and we slipped through the white picket fence because we have white skin and an Irish surname. But when they found out that we were Jewish, we also found that they had painted a swastika inside of our house. My parents painted over it and didn't tell me until I was an adult. This is what that view looked like for me. My name's Hillel Leary, and I am a non-binary Jew. This is what it felt like to look out my window, a sense of oblivion and chaos. And people didn't really like me too much, especially because I was a real fucking weirdo. My parents called me an alien. I used to run around with a cape on. I was always very extra, and it had actually taken a lot of work to stop doing that quite so much. Because of this, I always had a sense that home was not a concept or a place that I could call mine. There was always a disconnect. There was always a distance between this idea of safety and where I was at all times. It was an abstraction to me. There was a lot of violence. This is the number of people who have tried to murder me. No exaggeration, I've counted, and spent some time with my therapist. Some of these people were friends, or people that I thought were friends. Some of them were lovers, and some of them were people who were charged with protecting me. But no one ever did. This is the number of years that I spent facing poverty and extreme housing insecurity, including sometimes being homeless. And that involved sleeping in guest rooms, and in the woods, and in places that didn't have heat. And at some point, I even had to sleep in my van. And I remember crying myself to sleep that night. It was hard. This is the number of years that it's taken for me to feel safe for the first time. That's last year. It's a long goddamn time to not feel safe. There was always a distance, still trying to figure out where home is, where safety could be, and how, if any way, I could find that. Even in the home that I grew up in, I was not safe. It was a violent place. It was not somewhere that I could feel comfort. This is an image that was in my portfolio when I applied to RISD. This is in the basement of the house that I lived in. I hoped that if I had made something that was pretty enough, that if I had made something that called enough attention to itself with good tonal range and an interesting composition, that someone might notice and that someone might see me and save me. But that didn't happen. And things got more grim. At some point, someone who I thought was a friend brought me up to Yonkers, or upstate as we called it. And we were supposed to visit a guy named Tommy, a friend, or so I was told. We got to this house, and as soon as we walked through the doors, I realized that there were just a series of faces that were blank. Family members, mother and father, staccato green flashes on their faces, parked in front of the TV. It didn't feel like somewhere that I was supposed to be, a feeling that I had had an awful lot of times. And so we went upstairs to go see Tommy. And when he opened the door, this is what I saw. I immediately in that moment made the same kind of calculations that I had done many times and still think about to this day. How much trouble am I in? So I turned around, scanning the room. I saw drawings of dismembered people. A lot of them were racist caricatures. And when I turned around to meet Tommy's face, there was a knife in my face. I remember seeing my reflection in that blade. And I remember thinking, is this the end? I didn't know. So I made another calculation. Tommy asked, "Are you a fucking Jew?" And I said, "No, my name's O'Leary, super Irish." And in that moment, I was white and I was safe. And I still think about that. There's a fine line between camouflage and death. There's another instance where I thought that someone didn't mean to do me harm and actually wound up causing a lot of it. I was in school. This was shortly after the first story that I just told you. A guy, let's call him Sal, very large dude. He used to carry around a bag of books. I don't think that he could read. He swung that backpack at me to knock me off my feet, time and time again, day after day. And eventually I had this sort of, fighting spirit that gets bred into people who are like constantly being attacked. And so I decided that the equalizer would be that I would find a way to hurt him and that then we would make up and be friends. Naive, I know, but it was the only chance I had. So we were in a shop class and I pushed him over in a desk and he was trapped under it. As I said, he was a big dude and he had trouble getting up and he laughed and I laughed and then everybody else laughed and I was like, oh, this must have worked. We're friends now. Later that week, he invited me over to his house to play video games, which I also should have known was not a good idea for me to do. I went there, and the first thing he showed me was a fort that he had dug in the backyard, covered with a tarp. After playing a couple of video games with him, he started losing, and he started getting angry. He chased me outside. He knocked me over. He was much bigger than I was. He took a 2x4 and he tried to break both of my legs with it. And in that moment where I was incapacitated, he told me that he dug that hole for me. That is a kind of fear that I hope that none of you have to experience in your lives. I managed to get up and tackle him and run, which was something that I'd also done more times than I'd like to count. I realized that this was a system, a cycle that was happening. And I found out that Sal actually came out of the closet not long after this happened. He called me a queer when he was trying to kill me. There are pressures that exist in our world. There are forces that make us do things, that shape who we are. And they have deleterious effects. One of those is a system of reverberations that happens across time through decades and centuries. And there's a fun word for that. Generational trauma. So I started to think about this a lot. It had shaped so much of who I was, and it was clear that a lot of the things that I learned about how to be a man, which I'm not, by the way, that they were steeped in this. This is my grandfather, or Gramps, as we used to call him. He was one of the toughest people that I've ever met. He was about this tall and was a Russian barrel of a man and waxed his mustache. And he arm wrestled every man that he ever met and won until he was in his 80s, which is pretty ridiculous. He was also someone who comes from a lineage of having to run and having to fight for his life. And there are multiple ways that we cope with that. For him, there was a choice: assimilate or die. But still, there was a little bit of caricature. There was a little bit of ownership of an identity that was uniquely Jewish, that was uniquely positioned. It was a small act of resistance. That sparkly gift before, that's another version of that. It is the dark Jewish comedy that I am certainly a fan of, and I hope you appreciate. I found out that my grandfather, the man who was jovial, who made me a plastic comb for my bar mitzvah that said, "We partied at Hillel's bar mitzvah," also worked on the Enola Gay, the plane that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. So this man who was this kindly engineer maker was also part of this enormous tragedy that I could barely even comprehend. And there I was learning from this man and knowing that, if you look at that painting on the left there, knowing that there were things in the past, somewhere in my brain, somewhere that I couldn't quite grasp yet, that things weren't right. If you look all the way to the left, that's actually a portrait of my grandfather. And there's me doing a really bad job of being a dude. I think I'm pretty grossed out by that fish. I still haven't gotten much better at that. I also turned into a 90s high school bully because I thought that that was what a man was supposed to look like. I had learned that I had to be tough, that I needed to put this armor on. By the way, this is in August in Tennessee when it gets worse. When I was with my mom's ex-boyfriend to go into the parking lot of a gun show to buy a grenade launcher out of the trunk of some dude's car. It's like, how did I even do that? Sounds ridiculous. But it got worse. I've refined this, and I went from being a kid who just wanted the sparkliest Batman and who wanted to wear the mesh tank top and the propeller hat and be super flamboyant and have a good time, to someone who was being so flamboyantly and performatively masculine that looking back on it, it's pretty silly. And also, diet pills suck. I became someone whose tools were violence and posturing. I was cage fighting at this time, which now I would never dream of doing that. A good friend of mine who's in the audience suggested that it's possible that I might actually be a drag king, and I think that that is the best description that I've heard for my particular performance. As you can see, I had a problem wearing a shirt that didn't have a skull on it. None of my shirts had sleeves. I have cropped these appropriately so as to not expose you to that. I was smoking cigars inside and wearing sunglasses, and I had no idea, but also I had a deep idea that this was not real. But I didn't know who I was. I didn't understand what was happening, and that dissonance over time created a situation where there was nothing. It was hollow. And there's a crisis in that I needed to start reflecting on. So I started making work that directly addressed where I had been and what I thought was happening. On the right there, that's a cast porcelain leather jacket. It is a casting of that exact jacket that I had. I've kept it for a long time. It had this magical power to it in some way. Magical power of bad choices and a lot of sweaty Tennessee stuff, which is a phrase I should consider revising. So I started to wonder, what are some other ways that we make things sacred? What are some ways that we keep things from the past and make them powerful? How can we show that? And one way that I found was when I was in Florence there's a series of beautiful reliquaries in the Medici Chapel. And it's a series of bones and little collections of things that had some sort of religious or metaphysical power, and that people wanted to keep these things because they made them feel special. They made them feel like they were connected to something. And I began to wonder, what if I was special? What if I mattered? What if people like me had a place to feel like they belonged? And so I started to think about using the language of the sacred, the architecture of some religions that I borrowed from. And that had deeply been a part of my own life, whether for ill or for good. And here you can see there's that little house on the left, this idea of where does home come from. In the center there is a reliquary, and we'll zoom in on that in a second. On the right there, that is the picture of me wearing that jacket beneath that cast jacket, a thing to be cast off, something that is fragile, something that's white, something that could be destroyed instantly so that we can move on. So in this final slide, I want to share a story with you. A good one this time, I promise. When I showed this, there was a 6-year-old who was a big fan of this work in particular. He said that he liked it because it was sci-fi, it was futuristic, and it was cool. And of course, I picked the gayest Batman that I could find. The sparkly sticker, that ruins the CNC milling and the laser cut acrylic. My aesthetics have gotten a little more on point since then. One of the other things that you'll notice on the bottom there, that bottom capsule, that is actually one of the skulls that I cut out of one of those t-shirts in the previous image. What you can't see is that there's also a small canister that's full of leg hair from the first time that I shaved my legs after I was like, you know what? I'm not a man. I'm going to do this. This is my way of reclaiming this energy and this sacredness. And he thought that that was kind of ridiculous. And I think that's true. I have to give him credit for that. But this is a story that he's going to tell, and it's in the telling of the story and the sharing that I've begun to find how my own story is shaping up. And I thank you for sharing that with me. Thanks.